Hello and welcome to This Week in Introduction to Philosophy, where we're going to be looking at a version of Oedipus the King, the ancient Athenian play by Sophocles. It's often known as well by its Latin name Oedipus Rex, which just means Oedipus the King. In its original Greek, it was Oedipus Tyrannus, which is a slightly different sort of meaning than Oedipus the King. It's the root of our word tyranny. So it means a king that didn't come to the throne by a natural succession. And there's a feature of how Oedipus comes to the throne. In fact, he is the legitimate successor, but he doesn't come to the throne as the legitimate successor. So there's a sort of complication in the story with regard to the story of Oedipus. The version we're going to watch is Edipo Alcade, which was made in the late 1990s by Jorge Ali Triana, and it's as we'll see, it's set in the Colombian Civil War, and it tells the Oedipus story in a kind of interesting way, using that scenario as a kind of background to the story. So it sort of gives an interesting take on the story that we're going to take a look at this week. All right, so our dramatis personae, our people in the play. Our list is quite short this week, and we have Oedipus, who is the main character, the main focus. The priest is a kind of minor character. He's often not in a lot of the sort of film versions of the play. Creon is Oedipus's brother or half brother, so he has a kind of close connection to Oedipus, and they are related, and that sort of, there's in the version we'll see that sort of relation. He's a kind of he's a pastor or herder, as we'll see. But those two have a sort of combative relationship in the play, and at the end of the play, at the end of the original play, it's Creon who kind of takes over the throne after Oedipus's demise, and Creon becomes the kind of leader afterwards. In the original play, again, we don't really see this in Edipo Alcade, but there's a chorus. And as we've talked about, the chorus in ancient tragedy was a kind of musical. It was a musical part. It was about the singing of music, this sort of collective singing of parts. So the chorus, in contrast to the protagonists who sort of have spoken roles, the chorus is a singing role. And so there's, especially when we sort of look and think about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, there's this theory of how the music is working as really the expression of the tragic, what's happening in the kind of tragic tendencies in the play, and the voices are kind of this superficial surface response to the chorus. Tiresias has an interesting role, as we'll see in the play. He's a blind prophet in the original, and Tiresias is the one who knows about Oedipus's fate and tells Oedipus about his fate, and Oedipus gets very angry. So Tiresias, and the same thing happens with Creon as well. Oedipus sort of gets very angry and hot-headed with Creon. So we'll see this with Tiresias as well, and the fact that Tiresias is blind gives his words an added weight, and we'll see that there's an important theme in the play about blindness and sight that we'll see with Tiresias. Jocasta is Oedipus's wife, and again, she doesn't. She is also his mother, but she doesn't know that at the start of the play. So there's this discovery that takes place, and really the play as a whole is about the discovery by Oedipus of his own identity, of who he is, and his sort of discovery of his own backstory. It's almost like a detective story where that backstory is kind of gradually revealed throughout the play. The messenger and the herdsman of Laos are the two people who kind of give the convey the message to Oedipus that the person he thought was his father in the other town of Corinth. He finds that person is dead, but he can't. And now he's relieved. But then he finds out through the herdsman that he's actually he was actually moved from Thebes, and so it turns out that he was the child of Laius and Jocasta. And of course, when he finds that out, he can put two and two together and sort of tell the whole story. All right. So if we take from the bottom left, which is the incentive moment, the beginning, and the play opens with this idea of a plague on Athens. In the story we're going to watch, as you'll see, that's sort of changed into it's a civil war, and so the crisis is not a plague, it's a civil war, but it works in the same works to sort of generate the action in the same way. So there's an oracle that says you have to find the murder of Laius or the plague will be lifted. So Oedipus sets himself that task of finding the murderer of Laius, who was the previous king, and Oedipus is now the current king of Thebes. So Oedipus and Tiresias accuses Oedipus, and then Oedipus and Creon quarrel and argue, and eventually we reach the point where when the messenger arrives from Corinth and tells Oedipus that Polybus from Corinth is not his real father, that's when the kind of climax of the story happens, and Oedipus recognizes and realizes his own fate, his own story, that he was taken to Corinth as a child, brought up as the child of Polybus and Merope, when in fact he's not their child at all. He was born the child of Jocasta and Jocasta and Laius in Thebes. And when the oracle, there was an oracle at the time that said this child is going to murder his father. So the parents decide to put him on a hillside to die, but of course the child doesn't die. He's taken by the messenger to Corinth, where he's brought up in ignorance of his real origins. So when he finds this out, this is what, on Aristotle's theory, this is the moment of peripateia, which means reversal, and anagnorisis, which means recognition or coming out of ignorance. So the moment of reversal, when Oedipus's fate is reversed, he goes from being the king of Corinth, he goes from being the king of Thebes to being an outcast walking with a stick who's blinded himself, as we'll see, that theme of blindness and sight. So that's the peripateia, the reversal, and the agnorisis. The recognition is Oedipus's own awareness and recognition of this reversal of his fate. So those two, the reversal and the recognition, occur at one and the same time. And Aristotle talks about that in the Poetics as being an important detail. So Jocasta commits suicide, Oedipus blinds himself, and the play ends with Oedipus going into exile. As you'll see, the version we're watching maintains a lot of these details. In fact, it maintains the names from the original, but some of the things are slightly changed to sort of adapt the story. But you'll see the same basic plot is maintained. So Edipo Alcade, Oedipus Mayor, is set in the Colombian Civil War of the 1990s. So the film creatively uses this civil war like the plague on Thebes in the original film to sort of drive the sense of crisis. There's a sort of urgency of action to sort of to try and diffuse things, to try and solve the situation. And that's when the mayor tries to go to these villages and tries to impose a solution, as we'll say, to end the violence. So that's kind of the way this film changes the scenario somewhat, but still keeps the original story. So it's worth thinking about Oedipus's identity when we think about the film, when we think about Aristotle's theory in particular of the tragic hero. So Oedipus's fate as a as sort of the person who is under these two kind of taboos of killing his father and sort of marrying his mother. Those are the two kind of the two most basic social taboos that Oedipus breaks. But there's some interesting features about Oedipus's identity that give us clues to what all this means and what's happening here. And I think one of the most important clues to Oedipus's identity is this idea of the puzzle solver or the problem solver. Before he gets to Thebes and becomes king, when he's sort of wandered his way out of Corinth, Oedipus meets the Sphinx, and that's the figure we see on the right here. So the Sphinx is terrorizing the city of Thebes, and Oedipus makes the Sphinx disappear by solving his riddle, and he's the only one who's able to solve the riddle. The Sphinx's riddle is what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs on the afternoon, and 3 legs at night. And the answer is it is man. You walk on 4 legs when you're a baby, when you crawl, 2 legs when you're an adult, and 3 legs when you're old and you walk with a cane. So Oedipus solves the riddle, and then he's sort of made king because he saves the city. So the interesting detail here, it focuses on Oedipus's cleverness. Nobody else can solve the riddle. Nobody else has the sort of intelligence or the cleverness to do this, the cunning to do this. So it sort of puts the emphasis on Oedipus's identity as a kind of a solver of puzzles. On the left, we see the death of Laius, the previous king, who was killed at the crossroads. And so this is when the plague is announced. This is the death that Oedipus has to solve to save the city. So it's like, here's another puzzle that Oedipus has to solve, just like the puzzle of the Sphinx. The puzzle here is who killed Laius, and Oedipus takes it upon himself to find the puzzle. Of course, eventually he's going to find out that Laius is his own father, and Oedipus killed him on his way to Thebes. He didn't know it was his father, of course, at the time. He just thought it was some rude old guy with a bunch of servants. So again, the answer to the riddle is it's man, it's Oedipus, it's myself. You know, as far as Oedipus is sort of telling the tale, but it's his task to sort of solve the puzzle. So again, we see an emphasis on his sort of cleverness, on his intelligence, and we'll see his identity worked out as he tries to solve this puzzle. And we see that identity worked out in his character traits as he goes about solving this. And so a question we want to be asking when we watch Oedipus, when we watch what he does and try to understand what he's doing and what's happening, is we think about the idea of hamartia. And what is Oedipus's hamartia, right? What is the mistake, the error? What is the kind of the friction with the circumstances in Oedipus's character that's causing that's sort of contributing to his downfall, right? So remember, we're looking with hamartia, we're looking for something that sort of runs between those two extreme options, right? We don't want something that sort of explains him as a morally flawed character and it's his kind of bad or evil ways that bring him down, because if he's a bad or an evil character, we can't identify with him, and if we can't identify with him, it's not tragedy, right? We're not going to feel pity and fear. So we don't want a focus that makes him into a bad person, because then that's not going to be tragedy. On the other hand, if his actions don't contribute at all to his downfall, then it's unclear how we understand it and how we understand what happens as a tragedy. So we need some kind of action from Oedipus. We need some kind of responsibility, but that can't be the kind of responsibility that turns him into a bad person, right? So it has to be something about his character, something about the way he acts, about his sort of hot-headedness, his stubbornness, his willingness to accuse others, all of those things, that sort of reveals these traits of character that sort of make him succumb to this bad situation and contribute to his downfall. So an important element for ancient Greek tragedy, and certainly for Sophocles, is this idea of hubris. And this idea that pride breeds the tyrant, violent pride, gorging, crammed to bursting with all that is overripe and rich with ruin, clawing up to the heights, headlong pride crashes down the abyss, sheer doom. That's from the text of Oedipus the King. And so this idea of hubris, which is here pride, is this fundamental thing that that sort of sets out categories and sets out barriers between different categories, and how those barriers are violated in exercises of hubris, right? So often we think of hubris as a kind of it's sort of getting ideas above one's station, kind of going beyond what's permissible, doing things that you can't possibly accomplish, but thinking that you're able to do it. So we see this attitude with Oedipus in his kind of confidence that he can find the answer. So he goes about interrogating Tiresias and Creon, and wants to know the truth so he can fix the problem, right? And so the question might be here whether it's possible for Oedipus to really find the answer, whether when he finds the answer it's going to solve things, or whether it's going to create chaos, as in fact create his downfall, as in fact happens. So this difference between what humans aspire to know and what's possible for us to know and what's good for us to know is a real important theme, kind of raised by the play and the film. And this idea that sort of grasping for things and trying to know and understand things, that it's not humans' province to understand or to know. This is an important theme for the Greeks and for Socrates, as I said, and we can see how it sort of works out in Oedipus, with Oedipus clearly sort of embodying these elements of hubris in his desire to know everything that happens. So the idea of fate, we can see, is very important for Sophocles, the author of Oedipus the King, and we can see that he presents this kind of divinely ordered universe, whose workings are beyond the knowledge of human beings, and human beings experience these mysterious workings as fate, right? So it's fate that decrees Oedipus is going to live a certain way and be subject to these horrible things happening that he doesn't know about. These are things that work beyond his knowledge. So that, for Sophocles, is this idea of a universe that works beyond human knowledge. And of course, it's in contrast with this idea of free will, of the idea that humans shape their own fate. If we sort of believe with Sophocles in this idea of fate that's sort of thrust upon us, then we can see human experience as kind of always faced with this difference between what we can know and what's going to happen to us, this difference of fate, where incidents and things happen to us without our knowing and without our being aware of why they're happening. So Tiresias, as I said, has an important role in the film as the blind prophet, who knows the truth about Oedipus's past. And this idea of sort of the blind person who knows the truth contrasts with Oedipus himself, who of course can see throughout the film and has eyes and vision, but at the same time doesn't know the fundamental truth about who he is. So we see that, when Oedipus reaches the end of the film, he finds out the truth and he blinds himself to kind of recognize this important fact about blindness, that there's a truth that's accessible to blindness which we can't know when we're in the world of sight. And it's a sort of visual representation, I think, of these two orders of sort of human knowing, which is the world of sight, and then there's the world of blindness, which is fate and everything that's sort of unknowable for humans until it sort of happens to them, until they're subject to it. So that sort of opposition, I think, is nicely dealt with in the play as the opposition of sight and blindness. And finally, when you're watching and when you've finished, it's worth thinking, since this is an adaptation of Oedipus the King, think about what worked and what didn't work. What did you like and what didn't you like about this adaptation? Were there some things that were successful? Was the Civil War scenario successful? Were some of the characters sort of well drawn? Another thing to sort of bear in mind and be thinking critically about when you're watching the film